As we're going to go through three stories, starting with this week's coming parsha, and we'll see how it goes. All right, we'll talk about it. These three stories. All right, so the first one, in the first words of this week's parsha, Parshas Vayetze. Right, so in last week's parsha we ended off that Yaakov kind of does a little trick, right? He gets the brachas from Esav. First he gets
thanks to Rivka.
Thanks,
and
right?
This question has always puzzled me. When Yaakov was found out, Rivka says the sin should be on me. How come Rivka didn't come forward and say to Esav, it was my doing, leave Yaakov alone? It always puzzled me.
Right. It's a good question. Why saying Rivka should have went to Esav and said, I did it. Maybe she was afraid he would kill her. Maybe.
Would Esav kill his mother?
Would he kill his brother? Right?
Yes. All right, so,
I don't know.
all right.
I'm just saying, obviously, she wasn't too. I mean, the whole thing is a question from beginning to end, right? So first he tricks Esav into giving away his birthright in the beginning of the parsha, right? And at the end of the parsha, he gets the brachas. And even Yitzchak is okay with it at the end, right? Rashi says that he was moided to the brachas, right? He agreed that Esav should get the brachas that Yaakov should get the brachas because he had given his birthright. So then Yitzchak said, okay, I did the right thing. I gave the brachas to the true Bechor, right? There's a saying in the Zohar that from the forest itself comes the handle for the axe. You heard of this expression?
From the forest what?
From the forest itself comes the handle for the axe. In other words, sometimes in order to overcome something, you need to engage with the thing on that level, right? In other words, to cut down trees, you need a tree, right? In order to engage with Klippa, sometimes you have to use their own methods, right, of trickery, etc. We see this a lot. Anyways, so in the end of the parsha, Yitzchak blesses Yaakov, tells him goes to Haran. Go to your uncle Lavan and get married, right? Don't get married from the Benos Canaan. Don't get married to the native people of Canaan. You should get married to somebody from our own family. So, from the Jewish people, essentially. So, the first thing it says, right? Vayetze Yaakov, Beersheva, Vayelech Harana. Right? You see that the first pasuk of this week's parsha. So, the Medrash and Rashi both bring out. What's the problem with this pasuk? Let's look at the pasuk simply. Why does it have to say Vayetze? Right? Why does it have to say and he went? And he left, I should say. Why not just start Vayelech Yaakov Harana? Yaakov went to Haran, right? If he went to Haran, then obviously he left Beersheva, where he was. So the Medrash asks. So that's the obvious question. The Medrash asks an even more interesting question. So it says Yaakov left, right? What do you mean Yaakov left? Yaakov left, but he went with with sheep and mules and camels, right? So the Medrash says as follows, and Rashi brings it down to answer both these questions. That when a Yitzadik leaves a place, when a righteous person leaves a city, Bisman Shasadik Ba'ir, Huzivahu Hadra. When a Tzadik is in a city, he is its splendor and majesty. When he departs the city, its splendor and majesty is departed. In other words, the reason why I had to say, and then Rashi says the same thing, right? That he left Haran means that the whole splendor of majesty Beersheva, he left Beersheva, the whole splendor and majesty of Beersheva also left with him, right? Because he was a tzaddik. And similarly Rashi brings that we see also this word Vatetse for the female version in the story of Rus, right? That Naomi and Rus left, says and Vatetse, and they left. Right? It doesn't say that they went to the next place. Similar thing, right? She was the tzaddikus of that place. Right? She was the righteous person of that area. So therefore, when they left, it's a big deal, right? The leaving itself is like a big deal. Okay. So now So what's the obvious question? Where was Yitzchak? Where was Yaakov? Where was he living? Whose house? Do you remember whose house is he living in? His father's house. His father was Yitzchak Avinu. So how are you saying that the splendor and majesty of the city left because the tzaddik left? What do you mean? There's still a tzaddik there.
Where was Yaakov living? They said, right?
Yaakov was living with his parents, and the Torah says that he left Vayetze, and it's a big deal. He's leaving, and now the splendor and majesty of the whole city is gone. How is such a thing possible? Yitzchak's still there. Rivka's still there. So the Medrash tries to answer that you can't compare one righteous person to two righteous people, but it's still. But that's not what Rashi said. What did Rashi say? Rashi said that when its beauty has departed and the splendor, its beauty has departed, its splendor has departed, its majesty has departed. In other words, Rashi doesn't say, okay, it wasn't as good as before, so therefore we say Vayese, right? That he left. And now it's a little bit less. Rashi says, no, everything good about Beersheva left with Yaakov. Right? And that's the way Rashi says it. So, based on that, we have to have a different answer. And it's not addressed, by the way, by Rashi.
It's not a what?
It's not addressed, but Rashi doesn't address this idea. He doesn't say at all. Why? Rashi doesn't say, but the Yitzchak was there, right? He doesn't bring it up. So if you turn to page 6...
What's that about Yitzchak? Rashi doesn't address
Rashi doesn't say, how come that I'm saying that the whole splendor and greatness of the city of Beersheva is leaving with Yaakov, even though Yitzchak's still there. Rashi doesn't address this at all. You would think a Ben Chamish L'Mikra, Rashi is there to explain what a Ben Chamish L'Mikra would do, right?
I read someplace that because Yitzchak couldn't see that he was blind, he was almost considered dead.
That's right. That's the answer. So that's on page 6.
But I
Okay.
don't agree with that.
Let's see what he says. If you see later in page 6, right? So later on, when Yaakov has his dream, right? You remember Yaakov's dream, right? He sees the ladder. He sees the ladder, right?
Angels from Eretz Yisrael are going up. And
that's right. The angels going up and down the ladder, and Yaakov is addressed by God, right? He says, Yaakov. That Yaakov addresses God, right? What does he say? Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, right? He asks God, he prays to God that he should be protected, right? When he's going into Lavan's house, right? And so Rashi says we don't see anywhere that we use the word the God of about a person who's still alive, right? So what does Rashi say? Rashi says that a person who's blind and he's stuck in his house, right? He's considered as if he passed away.
Oh my gosh!
That's
a pretty harsh statement.
It's a very harsh statement. So what does that mean? What does that mean? He's like he passed away.
That's an insult to blind people.
It's an insult to blind people. I don't think it's an insult to blind people as much as it's really what it is that this is the reality of what we're going to see is what does that mean that he's passed away. Right. Let's see. Let's continue for a second before we get to making broad statements. Yeah. So if we see so in other words, what was the difference? Rashi says clearly it's not just that he was blind, right? He was stuck at home. He was confined to his home, right? And the reason why he passed away, right? The Yetzirah pasuk menu, the evil inclination ceased from him. In other words, on the contrary, right? It was almost a benefit to him, right? In other words, he had no more struggle, right? God took away any struggle from him. The person without struggle, it's like he passed away, right? In other words, he is on the same level of a person who passed away, right? Obviously, also doesn't have struggle. So, but here's the key: Yitzchak was no longer able to be right. It says Rashi says clearly he was confined to his home, and not only that, Rivka was also confined to her home because she was taking care of Yitzchak. Right? Rivka is taking care of Yitzchak. So if that's the case, right, then they're not influencing those around them. Right? So in other words, when Yaakov left the city, the influence that Yitzchak had on the city also went away. because he was no longer able to see. He was confined to his home. His influence was no longer felt. So when Yaakov left, that influence was gone. Therefore, the city, that's when Yaakov left, right? That Panahoida, Panaziva, Panahadra, that the beauty and the splendor and majesty has departed from the city. Right? So the title of this class is what makes a Jewish hero. Right? What makes a hero? That was the title of the class. So what makes the hero? So in other words, the influence that he had is what made Yitzchak Yitzchak. Right? The influence that he had on his surroundings. So once that went away, right, it was no longer relevant. Once he was no longer relevant to the influence because of his deteriorating health, right? The same thing. So he's no longer, his influence is no longer felt. It's like, so therefore when Yaakov departed, that influence also departed. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so that's the first story. Let's go to the second story on page 8. Second story, you'll see, right? Rashi says, and in the pasuk in Noach, right? It says that Noach was righteous, he was perfect in his generation, right? So what is the Rashi's question? Why does it say he's perfect in his generation, right? Why don't you just say Ish Tamim Haya, right? He was perfect. Perfect, you could say also whole, whatever you want to say, however you want to translate it, right? So why did it say b'deraisav? What does Rashi say? You see on page 8, are you there?
On page 8.
Page 8.
Yeah,
You see source number 5?
Number 5.
See number 5?
He was not considered perfect in later generations, such as in the generations of Abraham, Moshe, and David.
Right, that's the Zohar. And source number 6?
Compared to his generation, he was righteous, but had he lived in Abraham's generation, he would not have been considered of any importance.
Right. So we see that Noach was why does it say generation? Because it was specific to his generation. He would have lived in Abraham's generation, Rashi says, right? He wouldn't have been considered of anything importance. So what's the problem? What's the $1 million question? And Noach and Abraham lived in the same generation, right? How old was Avraham when Noach passed away? See source number 7. How old was he?
Noah passed away in Abraham's 58th year.
So Avraham was 58 years old, or 57 years old. Okay, when Noach passed away, it's pretty old, right? That's definitely the same generation, right? He's not a kid. He was an adult, right? We know Avraham Avinu recognized God at the age of 3, and he further recognized God at the age of 40. Come to some opinions in the Medrash, Avraham actually learned in Noach's yeshiva. They knew each other. They met.
That's the first I heard of this.
So how can you say that Noach wasn't in the generation of Avram? Right? You're saying Noach would have been great if he wasn't in Avram's generation. So if we look, but here's the answer. Page 9. When is the first time Avram Avinu is mentioned in the Torah? How old was he? Forget we get to how old he was before we get there. What's the first time Avram Avinu is mentioned in the Torah besides his birth that he exists?
The end of Noah.
End of Noah. It says he's born.
Okay, Noah.
What's the first time we have an event in Avram Avinu's life? Lech Lecha. Right? God says, "Go from your father's house." Okay. How old was Avram Avinu at that time? He was 75 years old. Okay, so this is definitely way after Noach. Right? He was 57, 58 when Noach passed away. He's 75 when Hashem addresses Avram Avinu. Now, what's interesting about the whole Lech Lecha situation? What's interesting about the whole Lech Lecha situation is that it's not the first time that something exciting happened in Avram Avinu's life, right? What's the first time that Avram Avinu has something exciting? We have when he's 3 years old. He recognizes God, right? That's exciting. Next, we have one of the most famous stories of Avram Avinu's Mesiras Nefesh, of his self-sacrifice, was the story of Nimrod, right? The Nimrod threatened his life and threw him into a furnace, and the furnace turned into a garden. Tremendous miracle, right? In front of the entire nation of whatever that was. What nation is that? Iraq? Where was Nimrod king?
And his father was there too when that happened.
His father was there. His brother was there, and also tried to jump in. Right? Didn't work out so well. He jumped into the fire. He thought maybe it was a family thing. He jumped to the fire. Right? Anyways, this whole big story is not mentioned in the Torah at all. Right? Torah starts Lech Lecha. Right? Why? What changed? What changed by Lech Lecha? What changed by Lech Lecha was this was the beginning of Avraham's influence of others, right? We see that even when he left Haran, right? When Avraham Avinu left Haran, he left his father's house. What does it say? That Avraham Avinu left with his wife, his nephew, and the souls they had created in Haran. What does that mean, the souls they created in Haran? It means that he left with the people who he had influence. So he had influence before. But what is the difference? What happened to those people? What happened to the people who he influenced in Haran? It petered out.
That
Avram and Sarah influenced people. They had a whole entourage when they went to Eretz Canaan, right? When they went to Eretz Canaan, when God told them to leave their father's house, right?
Oh.
They had a whole entourage of people they had influenced. They had monotheism. He already founded, again, like we said, he had founded monotheism. Yeah, he had reestablished monotheism.
Yaakov went to
Haran, and Avram had left Haran, right? Because that's where Abraham's family was from.
Yeah, okay.
So when Yaakov went back, he was going back to his grandfather's family, right, to Lavan. Anyways, so what do we see from here? We see that the influence that Avraham Avinu had only really started at the age of 75, when God told him, right, that you're going to be a nation. You have a great nation. Right, and Yitzchak is born, and that's really where the influence of Avraham Avinu starts to have a lasting effect. So, what do we see from here, from this story? That Avram and Noach, even though they overlapped each other, it didn't really matter until Avram Avinu was having an influence. So, in other words, the generation of Avram Avinu is not the physical years that he lived, but what is it? It's the influence that he's having, the impact that he's having on others. And that did not overlap, right? Because Noach did not have an influence he had passed away. And by the time Avram started having an influence on people, right, he was 75 years old. And Noach had passed away many years earlier. Okay? Okay, last story. So there's a story in the Zohar that, story in the Gemara about Rav Shimon Bar Yochai in Tractate Sukkah, 45b. Okay? You see on page 11? Page 11. Okay. So, V'amar Chizkiah, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Mishum Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Chizkiah said, Rabbi Yirmiyah said, in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, I can absolve the entire world from judgment of their sins. So, what does that mean? Well, he could, right? In other words, nobody would be punished for any of their sins. So what's the problem with that? The problem is that we know that punishment of someone's sins is not just to punish. God is not evil, right? God is not out to get us. Why does God punish us? So, the Alter Rebbe explains, we see here on the bottom of page 11, that you want to read that last paragraph? The Alter Rebbe compares,
There's people receiving these punishments to the young son of a king who has soiled himself, and the king wishes to clean them so that they will be able to be together.
Right, so that the king is cleaning the son so they could be together. In other words, sometimes it's not just, and he continues, sometimes not just cold water is good enough. You need hot water. Sometimes very hot water. It might be a little bit painful process, but obviously there's a benefit to that. So obviously, what is the benefit? So in other words, if there's a benefit of being punished, right? It's a cleansing process. The punishment, right? Let's rephrase that. If judgment is a cleansing process, right? Why would Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai want to annul that, right? Wouldn't he be taking that away? So what's the explanation? You see in the page 12 in the middle that when Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, when Rabbi Shimon declares he has the ability to erase the punishments, he obviously means he could cause the cleansing to occur in a different way without avoiding pain. And this was a special approach that only Rabbi Shimon was able to do, right?
Yeah.
And this was specifically through his teachings of the last page in the back. Here, the last page, the back.
On the back.
Yeah, and just all the way. No, one more. Here, this fish. Here, you can just take this one. That's what we're up to. See, right? So Rabbi Shimon says that. You see, right? See right there. Yeah. This is specifically in the fact that he opened the well springs of the inner dimension of the Torah. So specifically through the inner dimension of the Torah, and the merit of those teachings, behavior, and influence, he has made his path a reality for all people and gave them the ability to transform their behavior. Right? So in other words, specifically through studying the inner dimension of the Torah, Rabbi Shimon gave this ability. So what do we see? What's the common denominator between these three stories? For sure, the first two stories, pretty obvious, right? Is that what makes a Jewish hero is his impact on others. Right?
Yes.
It's not his holiness, it's not his spiritual devotion, right? It's how he could affect others. And Rabbi Shimon as well, right? He was able to affect others through his teachings. He was able to bring, it wasn't just that his teachings were so holy, but he was able to bring, through his teachings, right? He was able to bring people to a higher level, right? In other words, it's his impact. And further, maybe we could even say it's like a little bit of, it's like what came first, the chicken or the egg, right? Is it the impact that he has makes him the hero, or is it the people that make him the hero? Is it him or is it the people? Right? We know that what makes Ein Melech B'lei Am, there's no king without a nation. In other words, it's the nation that makes the king, right? If you come and you announce tomorrow, I'm the king of my house, right? Nobody cares, right? Only thing that makes you the king of your house is if other people recognize you as the king of your house, right? Or the king of something. So through your influence, that's what makes these Jewish leaders so great, right? The impact that they had on others. Any questions, comments, thoughts on these stories?
Yitzchak wasn't as active as Avram. In yesterday's parsha, he was striving with those with
the wells.
He was striving with the people of the wells, and then one minute he's digging wells, and the next minute it goes. He's old.
Right,
He's old,
but he did have an influence, because that whole story with the wells, even that story was a tremendous influence he had on others. What's the whole story? He was saying to people that these are the wells that my father dug, that Avram Avinu had dug, right?
Yeah.
And they had been filled by the Philistines, and he's saying they're mine, they belong to me. So spiritually, but in the end, he's successful in the end, right?
In the end, yeah, after he's chased off.
Yeah, but eventually he succeeds. So what happened in that story is that, spiritually speaking, there was this idea that Avram Avinu had created an influence of people. What happened? Avram Avinu passed away, gone. His whole influence was gone. The only people left who were influenced by Avram Avinu was Yitzchak and maybe Yishmael a little bit, his own children, right? And we see, in the end of the day, that's what happened, right? In the end of the day, what happened was the only continuity of monotheism is through the Jewish people, right? Through Yaakov and eventually Sinai, etc. Right?